Okay. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone, thanks for being here. We have the first hybrid seminar of the term, so we are a bit split between the room and Zoom. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, Yoshi. Everybody on Zoom, please watch your mutes. Yeah, so this is the fifth in the climate emergency series that we've been having this term. We've had a whole bunch of really interesting discussions up until now, and today in some ways is a culmination of many of the discussions. So today is all about how to do sort of policy and planning for climate change. And we have three really great guests here. So first off, we'll be hearing from Tompierre Frappé-Sénéclauze. Hopefully I said that right. So Tompierre is an EOAS alumni. He did his master's in glaciology here at EOAS. And he's now the regional director for BC of the Pembina Institute, which, if you're not familiar with the Pembina Institute, it's Canada's leading think tank on climate and climate policy. So he's going to give us some thoughts on how to be change makers, whether we're scientists or citizens, wherever we live. He can give us some hot takes on the BC Climate Action Plan. And then after that, we have Dr. Amanda Giang, who's an assistant professor in IRES here at UBC, the Institute for Resources and Environmental Sustainability. And she does a lot of research on informing policy design with science, particularly quantitative science. She's going to talk about some tools for how to do that, as well as some really interesting ideas on how to train the next generation of climate thinkers. And then finally, we have Fiona, who's doing her PhD here at UBC in zoology. And she does a lot of work on local place-based climate solutions for communities and indigenous groups dealing with the impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems. So she's going to be a real great capstone just to kind of talk about how to do bottom-up solutions while we talk about larger plans. So that's, I think, enough for me for now. I'm going to hand it over to Tom, and we can get her started. Yeah, just one sec here.
And remind me, where are we watching? Is that our camera?
Yeah, so you can be seen there in theory, and then you can also be seen here. So it's up to you. Let me just find one here.
Okay, I think this probably makes more sense if it's here, there.
Yeah, so this one you'll have control.
Body, yeah.
This one you have control of the slides, and then you can look to the right.
All right. Thanks, Colin. Hello, everybody. Oh, but I can't see them. Is there any way to see them at the same time? No.
The easiest way would just be to three fingers swipe.
Yes, fantastic.
There we go. And then you can go back and forth if you need to.
Okay. Hey, thanks for everybody online. We have a crew here in the space, in the flesh as well. I would strongly invite the folks online, if you're willing, to turn your camera on, because it just makes the online experience that much richer. And I promise actually look at you. Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Now I need to go back to the slides. Yes. So as Colin mentioned, I'm an EOS grad, and the glaciology with Gary is here. And frankly, this was, still is some of my IPS memories. Like the science the math is amazing, the science is fun, the field is glorious. And best of all, there's no flies, no ticks, and there's no waves. So for those who get seasick, glaciology is your choice. Somebody needs to mute, yeah. And then I remember I was at the AGU in Montreal presenting a poster that done on seismic volcanic eruptions. And I was attending the talk, and I realized like I was not that engaged in the topic of the talk, partly because I knew that we were really at risk, right? Like climate was on my mind, and the level of science that we were doing was exciting, but didn't seem to kind of correspond to the level of urgency that I was feeling in my guts. So I eventually kind of veered away from science and slowly started working more on policy. So as Colin said, I'm now working with the PEMN Institute. You might never have heard of the PEMN Institute, which actually would be quite normal, because we work mostly with industry and government. We don't do a lot of kind of public engagement per se, but we work a lot at the intersection of kind of where policy and practice of industry and governance happens. And that's what I'm going to talk about mostly about today. But I was asked, like, what's the role of earth sciences in climate policy in general? And I'm in a for a little bit. And like, there's a few that I can think of, like, oh yeah, there's some in energy planning around like how much water there's going to be in the BC hydro reservoir. Obviously, there's some function around mitigation, CO2 capture and sequestration, all the whole like field of climate risk and adaptation. Eventually, for carbon budget, if we ever go to policy that are based on carbon budget, there'll be a strong role for earth sciences on the side of the natural sinks of carbon budget. And then potentially on the geoengineering governance side, which we're not there yet, but we might get there eventually. That said, like, all the science there is context for policy, but it's not that involved in the process of policymaking. And like, frankly, like in the 10 plus years that I've worked at PEMN and working on policy, I'm sorry to say, I pretty much never used my science background other than, you know, in the way it informs the way you think. So I'm going to actually take a bit of a step back and talk about how policymaking, how change happens more generally, including as citizens, right? Because earth scientists are citizens and potentially as employees. So, you know, multiple spheres where we have influence, of course, in our personal lives, in our communities, the place where we live, in our workplaces, and eventually government, right? Where can we do, you know, transformative work? Well, we talk about our responsible consumption around our personal lives. I think probably most of you are aware that that's a bit of a red herring. Like, it's nothing fundamental is going to change by us changing our consumption habits or changing light bulbs, right? It has collective impacts, but doesn't change anything fundamentally. The education of our youth, on the other hand, does change things fundamentally. So that's a place we're all involved. Our stewardship of place and kin, which like Fiona is going to talk a lot more about in connection to climate adaptation on the ground there. So I'll leave Fiona to talk with this. The role of, you know, as we professional industry practice, governance of companies, the way we interface between like the apparatus of government, so the bureaucrats and the industry. So Amanda's going to talk more about this and kind of how we set bigger vision as communities for what we want in our society, which eventually shapes our governance, our laws, our regulations, and where we spend our public dollars. So Fiona and Amanda are going to talk on community. I'm going to focus a bit more, well, I'll stay in that kind of bigger sphere for a moment, and then I'll focus on how do we make change at the government level. So how, you know, this is where we have agency. How do we want to have agency? Typically, there's two broad sides, like there's an inside game and an outside game on any kind of change platform, right? So inside, like being lobbying government, being present with decision maker on a regular basis, consulting for companies, for governments, partnering with them, doing some environmental, social, and governance reporting. This is all kind of what I would call inside track kind of change making, which one can do as a professional. You know, and of course, like being the champion within an organization for change. There's very little change that happens on inside track if there's not an outside pressure from it. There needs to be a pain point that needs to be changed for change to happen with any complex organization. So some people's job it is to create that pressure. The most classic way is the form of like campaigns. So where we're trying to mobilize either voters, shareholders, or peers, you know, the simple peer pressure of practitioners, while other companies do it that way, tends to move, you know, like the financial sector is classic example of this. It's one bank starts to do things differently on the environmental side, like all the other banks kind of jump on the bandwagon pretty quickly. Of course, the role of media in that sphere, and to some degree, purchasing power, but mostly around the public procurement or just procurement of companies. If you're going to switch massive amount of money, Walmart, for example, had Walmart had a huge impact on cultivation of certain nuts because they said like, well, we're going to only buy almonds from people that have these sort of practices. And if Walmart says this, then the practices change drastically. So these are examples of outside game change strategies. When we're thinking about change, we need to think about like, are we aiming for incremental or radical change? And like radical is often has a kind of negative connotation, but really just means going to the root of the problem, right? And so that goes from the kind of tip of the iceberg to the patterns and trends, structures, mental model, and systemic issues, oppression systems that drive the way our complex system operate. So there's always a tension between incremental and radical change, because as you move up, so I kind of shrunk a little bit our circles or sphere of influence there. As you move up in the sphere of influence, if you're trying to engage companies and the way business is done, or you're trying to engage government, you're often forced to work within what is deemed practical, what is deemed pragmatic. Of course, pragmatic just means what the general majority of people in that sphere feel like they can do without getting smacked by somebody else, right? What is practical in terms of saving us from the kind of crisis is a lot more radical than what most government or companies are implementing. So that's something that we're probably all aware of. And so how do we navigate that tension? And that goes back a little bit to that inside game, outside game dynamic. It's like people that are on the inside have to work a bit more on the incremental model. People on the outside can change the framework that allows us to think and move to a more radical point of view. The other part, so when you're working from within those spheres, you mostly address the symptoms. If you're trying to tackle a specific issue, like in the case of feminine, like how we plan for energy use, the province and companies regulate various forms of energy use. And then if you try to go radical, you also need a change model. You have a theory of what is the root problem. So if you're talking about what influences government, so the dark blue here, you have less stakeholders to be engaged. So that the circle of where I'm trying to address the radical roots is a bit tighter here. And you can say, well, the root causes here are around like corporate influence, lack of representation, root problems that make democracy not work so well. And then, the solutions there would be like more direct democracy, changing financing rules for parties, having more institutional check and balances, so much so forth. So you have a mental model of what the problem is, and then you have, okay, well, here is a solution for that root cause. And again, you'll often be in a situation of, if you're trying to work from within, it's hard to address the root causes. But if you don't, you kind of stuck in a box that you have a real hard time, Einstein said, like, the definition of madness is trying to solve a problem with the same brain that created it. You need to change something in the game, in the rules of the game, if you're going to have different outcomes. So you need slowly to try to challenge some of these, what you consider the root causes. And here is my own kind of political analysis of what it is, but others might have others. And then as you go down, from government to industry, well, the problem with industry is fundamentally like our extractivist, capitalist, industrial worldview. And then you could switch that by switching to a cooperative circular economy. So you can work within industry and try to change the root cause by changing like the DNA of how we do business. And so much so far as you go down, on the collective community side, like, the way we structure our relationship around patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism affect all of our interactions and leads to all the other problems that we have, like this constant worldview where the value of oneself is measured by whether you're able to dominate someone else, which is as feminists would tell us, like the root problem of patriarchy. You measure the value of self by whether you're stronger than or can dominate others, traditionally women, but also other men and others. Well, we can see how that leads to the systemic problems that we have. So we need to change that DNA of our culture as well. Same thing around, when we're talking about the self, we need to change like the tackle of like the lack of empathy. How come that we're able to see the suffering of other people and not be touched? We're trained out of empathy and our capacity for empathy is not strong enough. Well, how do we resolve this lack of empathy? So having more kind of nurturance, more nonviolence practices as you raise kids in school, and so forth. So as you go deeper in the roots, we need to touch a lot more people. And the question is, when you are working from within, how can you leap between semantic level? How can you leap and address, systemic issues of sexism, racism, as you are working with corporations or companies? And of course, if you just stand in a meeting where everybody's trying to talk about, are we going to regulate natural gas venting, and you say, well, the problem is patriarchy, you're not helping the conversation move forward. And people are kind of like, yeah, okay, that's fine, thank you. But if you can help the conversation move forward and at the same time run them hand, and why don't we bring other people on the table, and why don't we hear from different voices, then you can slowly start to undo some of those paradigms. And then, some people work primarily at the spiritual, where like the core issue is the notion of separateness and the illusion that we're separate from one another. So practicing on the duality, non-duality level. But I think one of the key skills that we're all asked to bring now is to interweave these different levels. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, just died recently. And the thing that he did that touched me the most was to like mix all this, the spirituality of Buddhism with social activism. So it's like, yes, it's important to practice meditation and other things in order to be enlightened and to experience non-duality. But in the meantime, you also need to address systemic violence in the world and reduce the suffering of others. And you do this through action. So it's not if you're just in your cloud bubble of meditating every hours and not engaging with the world. You're trying to do both. How are we doing for time? I didn't actually time this. I just finished it before, so. Great. So as I was going to talk about political level. So let's talk about lobbying. How do we actually change the way laws and regulations are shaped? We need to understand first the current reality and then where the end goal we're trying to go to. Current reality, like basics, like what level of government has jurisdiction on this issue? How is this currently regulated? Who is the minister responsible? Who's the ministry responsible? And often there's going to be housed within one specific ministry, but other ministries might have a lot of influence. And then where are we at in the policy development on that specific issue? So if we take, the end goal, okay, what's our goal here? What are we trying to change? What government action is needed? Is it a regulation? Is it a program? And then what is possible to do on that action right now? So if we just do a bit of a quick thought experiment, okay, like what's our end goal? Well, let's focus on one of our many problems and say, okay, what if BC just really would meet its climate target and reduce its own emissions? What government action is needed? Well, let's look at the building sector. And one thing that's really needed is to address all the buildings that burn natural gas and switch it to a cleaner fuel like clean electricity. How are we going to do this? What is possible right now? Well, we can regulate the emissions of buildings. We can do what the province of BC decided to do right now, which is basically tell the gas utility and say, hey, you will be forced to bring your emission down of all your customer by about 47% by 2030, and then show us a plan of how you're going to get there. So we're not putting you out of business, because that would be a bit politically difficult to say to Fortis Gas and other gas company in BC, like, sorry, you can no longer exist. We're going to say you can exist, but you're going to have to change your business model and show us how you can reduce how much gas is burned, how much emissions come from this by X% by that date. So that's the kind of clarification from a goal to a policy lever that typically, the government eventually will come up with, but often influenced by organizations like PEMINA and others that can go, okay, here's one way you can regulate this that would work. I'm going to skip on this one for now and just talk. Okay, that disappeared. So who to lobby? First of all, like there's two main levels of government. There's the political sphere and then the bureaucracy. Political are all the elected folks and their staff. And if you're the federal government, there's a fair amount of them. In the province of BC, it's a relatively small crew. So you'll get, a minister will have 2, maybe 3 ministerial advisor, ministerial assistants. And then below that, they have the entire bureaucracy. And of course, the bureaucracy is nonpartisan, doesn't change with each government, and is there to inform the minister of what its options are. So when there's a new idea, you want to know, like, is there a mandate for that thing already? Like, do we have a mandate to regulate the emissions from natural gas burning in buildings? Well, as of last March, yes, in the climate plan, they said, okay, we're going to do this. So some staff suggested a bunch of action to their minister. The minister kind of said, yeah, that sounds good, brought it to the cabinet reviewed it together and said, yeah, okay, we can do this. That's a good compromise of sticks and carrots. And then eventually they write it, give a thumbs up to the staff, they write back and write the plan. And sorry, here as the staff, but it's actually the bureaucracy. They write a climate plan that says, okay, we're going to do this. Now, so right now there's a mandate on regulation of GHG emissions from natural gas burning in buildings in BC, but there's not yet the regulation. So now they go and write the regulation. First of all, they need to know if there's a law that they can use to, because a law essentially just give a minister power to do something. Very rarely, other than the criminal code, most public policies law, they say like, okay, the Ministry of X is entitled to make regulations that have these goals and these sort of parameters. Because you don't write all the details in law because the law is very long to write. It needs to be brought to the parliament. It needs to be debated. So you make the law kind of general and then you entrust somebody to go figure out the details. And that's the minister with this bureaucracy. So now they're at that stage of like, okay, we know we want to regulate carbon. How's it going to work? And they're trying to work on the policy. So if you're lobbying, it depends who you're going to lobby, depends where you are in that cycle. Ideally, you lobby all these levels because the minister ultimately is going to make the decision. The minister, often they're not experts. They're, they had a life before, but very rarely was their life on the topic that they're minister of. So they rely on input from their bureaucracy, but also from a lot of people that they meet and from their staffers. So the staffers are typically very, very smart people, typically quite young because they're not career bureaucrats. They change each time you change government, the staffers are all gone. So they're relatively young. They come with they have a partisan mindset. They're there to make sure that their minister look good and gets reelected, and that's the whole party. But they're also trying to achieve the goals of the minister. And if it's generally to solve climate change, they're trying to solve climate change. And then they rely on the bureaucracy. But the other thing is that between the political and the bureaucracy, there are a lot of lines and you can't just communicate whichever way you want. The minister can just go to a bureaucrat and say, like, what do you think about this? They ask for something, then it goes to the deputy minister and the assistant deputy minister, and then they write memos and then they get back a memo and they read it. So a key role that lobbyists play is often even just the bridge between the bureaucracy and the ministers, the political staff, letting them know, hey, this is what your bureaucracy is working on right now. And here's what's working and what's not working. So that third eye perspective is actually quite useful for political levels because they're actually often quite disconnected from their bureaucracy. And then of course, you also want to work with the bureaucrat because if they don't understand your idea, when it comes time to write the memo, they're going to say, they're not going to include that idea. And if the minister's like, hey, I've met with this person, the person says that we should, regulate how much emission comes from buildings. If the bureaucrats and deputy ministers are like, no, this is stupid ideas, this will never work, then the minister tends to back down. So eventually you kind of need to convince all these people. Luckily, most of the time you're not alone doing this, but that's part of why, when we say private companies kind of outgun civic society and lobbying, there's a lot of capacity put by private company to make sure that they're lobbying people, not just exchanging idea with all these people, but just spending time with these people so that there's a relationship. And so when you come with an idea, you tend to trust the people that you know, and you tend to trust the people that you golf with and spend time with. And so when you come with that ideas, they're warmed up already and they willingly listen to you because they have a relationship, yeah. So that's the heart of lobbying. Unfortunately, for most of us in civic society and most of you that cares about climate change, we got like a sliver of time to do it. So it needs to be quite targeted. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about the skills that are needed on there and then I'll wrap up on this. So, thinking about again, earth scientists or people that have been trained in sciences that are interested in doing that sort of work, or just to do it more effectively as citizens, whether it's through associative life or other, there's some basic skills that are not typically on the cursus of science that are needed, like convening skills, facilitation, chairing, note-taking, communication skill, like being able to write in plain English for a general audience, being able to write briefing notes, very concise media interactions. Storytelling is a key part of this. I know Fiona's going to talk more about this. Strategic planning. And it would add also in there just the capacity when we're talking about like leaping between different levels, the capacity to bring like either body or spirit into the room. So like the arts, like if you are trained in the arts and you can like start a meeting with a song, it will change the way that meeting goes. And that's one of the great luxury we've had, not luxury, but one of the great side effect of like slowly trying to indigenize a bit more our practices. Like one of the first things we started doing, which we didn't do here, was like acknowledging traditional land of where we're on. Here it's Colloquium mostly and Coast Salish in general. But also invite elders to come and speak. And when, hopefully many of you will have had that experience. When you invite an elder to speak, the vibe of the room changed because the pace is different, because of how they speak is different. Often it's just like, it's not a prepared speech that they come, they talk a lot more from the heart. And sometimes there'll be some drumming or some song or some prayer. It brings spirit into the room. And I think that's another kind of key skill that we need to build, partially like all of us that are kind of university educated, where you kind of live your life from here to here. Like, how do you bring the body into the spirit into the room? All of those skills, there's actually a lot of avenues for grad students and others to learn them within campus. I'm thinking about obviously teaching is a great way to learn about convening. Partially right now, if you can get like into problem-based learning space, there's a whole kind of science education initiative that's been happening. Like, so the more modern ways of teaching are really much based on facilitation and convening. On communication side, like there's some courses within, I don't know if it's tag anymore, but so there are resources within campus that can help build those skills. Also like associative life, like working within clubs or working within organizing circle builds a lot of those skills. I will leave it at that for now. And I will pass it on to Colin or straight to Amanda.
Yeah, we'll just transfer this over here. We'll just get the slides going. But your other notes, or did you want to use this one?
Oh, I sent you.
Okay, just a second. Let me transfer over. I'm just going to shift a couple of things over, but while we do that, thanks, Tompierre, for reminding me that I forgot to do the land acknowledgement, and it's entirely my fault just because I've been busy organizing this whole new hybrid thing that we haven't done in a while. Let me find your notes, Amanda. Did you send them to this email?
Oh, I thought I did.
Don't see them.
It looks like
Oh.
that's okay.
Okay.
It probably just didn't send. That's
Let's
okay.
use those ones.
Or actually, maybe. I'll do the two screens situation.
Do you want to? Okay.
No, this will totally work. I think.
I'll load this up for you. But yeah, while we're at it, so yes, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam and of the Musqueam people, as well as their neighbors, the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish. Apologies that I missed out on them. All right. Free to take it away,
Yeah.
or if you can just change anything.
No, I think this will work. I mean,
Yeah. Hang on. Let's fix that a different way. You should be, but that's I'm not sure if folks couldn't see because of. So let's do. It's okay. Folks, hopefully on Zoom can see that now.
thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, awesome. Hi everyone. Okay, yeah, the in-person and online is exciting, interesting. Yeah, so I did also. Whoop.
Just gonna move you over so that the other folks can see.
This does make me feel better about all of my teaching hiccups. Sometimes, when you're up there, you feel really like, oh my goodness, is this super easy or is this actually
Yeah.
complicated? No, it is complicated.
You had it dialed on Zoom and now it's just chaos. Yeah. No, I think Zoom is probably showing the wrong thing. So the most hated thing about Zoom is that it changes the windows around every time you do a share or change the screen. Okay, folks are seeing nothing.
I think you're paused on screen sharing.
There we go. How's that? Are we seeing Zoom share? Come on. Yes, this would be a very great time for Zoom to function. Yeah, maybe. Hang on. Let's just try this again.
That looks promising.
All right. Great.
Okay, let's. Can I actually advance the slides here? 1 second.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, excellent. Great, so thank you for inviting me. It's really appreciate the chance to be here and then also to be on this panel with Tompierre and Fiona. And you know, as Tompierre and Colin mentioned, I'm also really grateful to be working here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and working here as an uninvited guest, and then also as a scientist. I definitely feel personal responsibility to do work that not only supports climate action, but that works to center Indigenous sovereignty and knowledge systems in that process as well. Even if imperfectly in my work, and we can talk about ways that I and others can do that better. In addition, I also want to acknowledge and thank my amazing research group members, and then also collaborators and partners and alum. I'm speaking on this panel, but everything that I'm going to talk about is really reflecting the work of this broader community. So hopefully I did not forget anyone on those slides. Okay, so just a brief introduction to the work in our group. So in our group, we really focus on trying to develop analysis frameworks for nature society systems. And our goal is to try to inform decision-making around pollution, climate, and energy issues, and particularly decisions around technology, policy, and behavior change. And we're really interested in places where people interact with the environment. So both in terms of our impacts on climate, air quality, ecosystems, but also how those systems in turn impact human health, well-being, and equity. And so I think this sort of push for trying to understand the climate crisis as in dialogue with other issues or linked to other challenges, and to think about it from this more integrated systems perspective, it really comes from decision-making context. So from frontline communities, from policymakers, and I think a really recent and local example is the City of Vancouver's Climate Emergency Action Plan. So this is a figure from some of their materials. And it highlights how it really tries to bring together multiple goals, right? So less carbon pollution, greater economic benefits, and greater equity as well. And so this kind of decision-making need is what motivates a lot of the research in our group, because in these real-world decision contexts, it's seldom just about one thing, right? So historically, when we have kind of treated it as a single issue decision-making, not only have we missed opportunities, but sometimes we've also had really negative unintended consequences. So this has motivated some of the research in our group. And one of the questions that we try to tackle is, given that we want multiple things for our communities, how can we achieve a suite of goals through this process of energy transition? And what are the kinds of tools and knowledge and processes that we need to support that kind of decision making? So I'm going to talk about a few themes that have kind of emerged from our work on this question. And the first is just that energy system impacts extend beyond climate change. So energy systems are also major emitters, not only of greenhouse gases, but also health harming air pollutants. And the decades of research have really indicated that these air pollutants and their health impacts are not distributed equally, not in space and not socially. So an example of that is, here I'm showing a map of nitrogen dioxide concentrations in Vancouver. It's a key traffic-related air pollutant, and it's linked to a variety of health harms. And one of the reasons the concentrations are so high in that area that I've circled there is partly because there's a lot of road traffic, and some of that's linked to the presence of rail and marine terminals. So there's a lot of heavy duty and off-road vehicles that service these terminals. And so these terminals are absolutely, they're super important to local and global commerce. They have a lot of local and national benefits. But on the left, I'm showing the proportion of the population in each of these neighborhoods that identifies as Indigenous. And there's a substantial overlap in these two maps. And we find that Indigenous residents in Vancouver are exposed to close to 10% higher concentrations of this pollutant than non-Indigenous residents, which in some cases means that these concentrations are exceeding ambient air quality guidelines. So, to return to the theme of energy transitions, when we consider some of the pollution, human health, and exposure inequities associated with heavy duty traffic, really highlights some of the potential opportunities that might be associated with decarbonizing freight transport, right? And moving to zero emission vehicles as a priority area that could really benefit from public investment. So this is an article from a couple of years ago. So as Vancouver port expansion looms, residents fear what more truck traffic will mean for the air they breathe. And so these community concerns have been one of the driving forces of the Port of Vancouver's Clean Trucking Initiative, which where they're considering alternative energy vehicles, including, importantly, electrification as well. And so when we start linking some of these different impacts, we can potentially create new coalitions for driving climate action. And then we can also start to think about prioritizing our investments, right? So if we were going to think about, which routes we wanted to electrify first, can we choose ones where we can also really enhance some of those air quality benefits and equity benefits? Okay, so that was my first point, which is that, okay, there are lots of different impacts. But the second is that, again, if we're thinking in this decision-making context where we have multiple objectives, in some cases, our interventions to do better on one objective can result in additional benefits for other things we care about, and that's great. So the decarbonizing heavy-duty trucks is one great example. But in some cases, it might actually not be a win-win, right? So there might be some cases where if we're thinking from a multi-objective perspective, there are actually trade-offs where an intervention helps us do better on one, but then worse on another. And particularly when we're making investments in long-lived assets and infrastructure that are really hard to take back, it's really important to think about some of these potential synergies or trade-offs at the outset. So one of the areas where we're trying to use modeling and expert surveys to better understand some of those sorts of synergies and trade-offs is marine shipping, where we're trying to understand when doing something for decarbonization is good for air quality also, and then also places where decarbonization strategies might increase air pollution impacts or vice versa. And so the goal really here is to try to help inform investment decisions, for instance, for ship owners who are trying to invest in infrastructure and technology. Okay, so yes, if we're making decisions that try to achieve multiple policy goals, sometimes there are win-wins, other times there are trade-offs. And that doesn't mean it's not possible to try to enhance those additional benefits and try to minimize those trade-offs. I absolutely think that's what we should do. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that we're still going to have difficult choices sometimes socially. And that those don't only exist for fossil-based energy. So a lot of what I just talked about also applies in the context of conversations about scaling up renewable energy, for instance. So hydro, wind, solar, a lot of these, especially at the scale that we need them at for the energy transitions, are really land dependent. And so one of the examples of our work in this group is on the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric dam in Labrador. So there are absolutely benefits of this renewable electricity generation, but also some concerning aspects that were identified. And one of these was methyl mercury concentrations in fish after reservoir flooding, that we projected reservoir flooding, and the access to traditional harvesting, which is important for 3 Indigenous communities living on and downstream of the dam site. And so a lot of these downstream communities argued that it's also really important to recognize that these trade-offs aren't just occurring in a vacuum, and that they need to take into account the history of resource extraction and development that has harmed Indigenous peoples in Canada. So renewable energies, I'm just saying that renewable energy is also not without its own challenges. That doesn't negate our need to scale up these renewable electricity sources, energy sources, but it does mean that we need to confront these sorts of trade-offs head on. And that means that we really do need both better, more rigorous and innovative analysis, but also public deliberation about values and priorities. And so I think as climate researchers, one of the things we can do to try to contribute to this is analysis that helps illuminate these trade-offs. And I also think we need to be prepared to do that sort of analysis within a broader social context where we recognize that these debates aren't single issue, there are multifaceted, and that also involve values. And so reflecting on experiences and growth areas for myself and my group members, trying to do research that supports decision-making has highlighted, I think, that engaging in that kind of decision-oriented space and that science policy space might require a certain set of skills and attitudes, and Tom was alluding to some, and here are some additional ones. So things like systems thinking, collaboration, because we're recognizing that, again, if it's not a single issue, we really do have to work across different areas of expertise. Resilience and tolerance for complexity and ambiguity, and then inter and transdisciplinarity. So working both across disciplines, but also beyond disciplines and engaging in collaboration with societal partners. Reality, though, is that a lot of university research training hasn't necessarily always emphasized these competencies. A lot of university research training is really focused on models of inquiry that are really individual focused and within disciplinary silos. And that's still absolutely really important, right? We need people with that kind of deep disciplinary expertise. But can we complement that sort of expertise, particularly for people who are interested in engaging in those sorts of decision-making spaces, to expand the set of relevant skills to include things like this? So I'm involved in a couple of projects at UBC to try to reimagine research training in the context of the climate emergency and other sustainability challenges at the undergraduate and graduate level. Just listing some of my collaborators here. I also know that there's a lot of exciting activity happening on this across UBC, including led by Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science. So for instance, a new climate studies and action certificate that's in development. But I will leave this more for our discussion later. I think what's tricky about this and what we're trying to imagine is, what would it mean to make some of those skills that we've just been talking about, things like collaboration, stakeholder engagement, comfort in environments of stakeholder pluralism, more core to doctoral training, and in a way that's actually sustainable for students, for faculty, for staff, and the institution as a whole. So it's a big question. So maybe we can try to tackle it in the discussion. But just quickly, we'll thank various funders, research participants, and all of you for listening. And for bearing with the AV challenge.
Yeah, I second that last one. Okay, so Fiona, come on up. And Fiona does not have any slides, and the AV department thanks her. So we'll just let her take it away. Hopefully everybody can see you okay.
Okay, cool. This is my first time ever giving a talk with a mask. So just like wave if you can't hear me or if I'm muffled. Same goes for you on Zoom. So I want to just start by thanking you for inviting me to speak here today and for holding this space. I was saying to Colin earlier, I'm from the zoology department, and I don't know if we have a climate committee yet, but this is really inspiring. And I love that YASC has been having these weekly seminars. I think it's super important for us all to engage in this topic and think about the changes we can make at UBC. So I'm Fiona, I'm a grad student in the zoology department, and I study how climate change is affecting coastal ecology, coastal ecosystems in BC, but I also do a lot of work with certain community groups to work on a bit of adaptation in response to climate change and to just understand how communities are being affected by it. So I'll go into that a little bit, but I also want to just touch on how I tend to think about climate change and sort of interpret some of the content that Tom and Amanda have introduced to us in my language. Humans, we have a problem, right? We consume too much, we emit too much, and we degrade too much. And a lot of those practices are deeply linked with capitalism and colonialism, these systems that shape a lot of our world today, that have shaped it for hundreds of years, and that are huge contributors towards climate change, and that are grounded in inequity and in extraction. So as we think about how we need to respond to climate change, I think that it really does involve finding ways to radically transform our systems away from those inequitable and extractive tendencies. So I kind of think of, same as what Tom was introducing, these two buckets of change making. We have the mitigations actions, the emissions reductions targets, and then the adaptation actions that accompany them. some of them have to do with infrastructure, some of them have to do with the direct responses of our communities and our landscapes to climate change and how it's affecting us now. And then the second bucket are those more nebulous systemic transformations that need to happen so that as a society, we're not perpetuating our tendencies of extraction and inequity. And we just like move, hopefully, out of this climate change era. So sometimes it can be really hard to like sink our teeth into what that systemic transformation can look like for us. And I think that as we've mentioned, or many of us know, change has to take place across all of the scales, all of the sectors, but there's no one size fits all solution. There's no silver bullet to climate change. So I have started to think of things, rather than trying to think of the solutions, the fixes, I'm trying to think of guiding principles that can inform how we transform society, and that can potentially translate across scales. So I'm going to introduce a few of the principles that I've learned through doing community-based research that I hope can transform the system that I work within, which is largely right now the research arena, both within academia and with some nonprofits who I do work with. So that's the sector I situate myself in. I can tap into the systems of knowledge creation, knowledge interpretation, and knowledge communication. That is my sphere of influence, to use that language. And the scale that I work at is the local to regional scale. A lot of my work takes place in the Salish Sea, and specifically in the fjord that you drive next to on your way up to Whistler or Squamish from Vancouver, Howe Sound. And the Squamish place name for it is Atkatsim. So Atkatsim is located within the Squamish Nation's territory. And that's also where I live, within their territory. And then importantly, me as an individual, I'm a white settler woman who's a marine researcher. And I carry that identity into the work that I do. And it's really important for me to acknowledge it because it does affect the way that I do research. It really does. Research, you know, we used to think of science as a really objective process that's separate from us as the researchers, but we really have to engage with who we are and how that does affect the questions we ask, et cetera. And very importantly, the principles, the guiding principles that I've started to really connect with and that I'll be sharing today, I've learned in large part from the Indigenous communities who I work with and the Indigenous scholars who I work with. So I want to give credit to them and acknowledge that so that I'm not contributing to the continual appropriation of Indigenous knowledge as we talk about adaptation. Okay. So to just reiterate, I'm going to share with you two guiding principles that I think are really important in how I see playing a role in transforming the system that I'm operating within, the research system. So the first is reciprocity, and the second is the acknowledgement that language is power. So reciprocity is the simple concept that when you receive something, it's good to give back in turn. We want to remember to do that, but sometimes we forget. And in research, we've been trained, many of us have been trained in systems where we come into a field site or a community, we gather the knowledge, and then we leave. And very infrequently do we actually return to the communities or even to the organisms that we work with or the places or the glaciers and share that knowledge back to that community. So it's kind of like a linear and extractive form of knowledge creation. Now, as I've gone through grad school and as I'm kind of grappling with the ways that we do research, I've learned increasingly about community-based research, which I didn't know about, but it's a field that it has existed for a while. And it's the concept of doing research in partnership with communities. So that actually looks like, as a climate change researcher, coming to a community and asking folks and having conversations with them about what they care about, what questions they're interested that I can help to answer. And then talking about how we can do that. So co-forming the methods. And then also talking about how we can share the knowledge back to their communities so that they can use and interpret it and bring it into their own decision-making and planning processes. That's super critical. So that's one example of how I think that as researchers, we do have a really strong role to play in bringing reciprocity into our research process and trying to transform our systems of knowledge generation towards a more ethical and less extractive place. That's the first principle. The second principle is the acknowledgement that language is power. So this has a ton of different kind of dimensions to it. You can be speaking about the actual languages we're speaking, English, Mandarin, Hokkien, Spanish, you name it. The language that you use will affect who gets to access your information. So that's one step. but also language is word choice, right? So a couple of years ago, I had this really like aha moment when I was working with a few of my collaborators in the Squamish Nation. And it just kind of woke me up to the settler context that I grew up in. So growing up, I was kind of very familiar with the idea of referring to salmon and trees and rocks and water as resources. And when we think of these things as resources, that kind of comes with this idea that they're inert, non-sentient maybe, and things that humans have a responsibility to manage and kind of have dominion over, right? And I was having a conversation with, as I said, a few of the people, the community members in the Squamish Nation, and they said they don't think of these things as resources, they're life as opposed to resources. And life has a completely different connotation to it, right? Like life has its own spirit, its own culture, its own history, its own agency. And very importantly, when we think of trees and rocks and water and salmon as being forms of life rather than resources, they come at the same level as humans. So we stop thinking of ourselves as elevated or separate from these landscapes. We're part of it too. And we have a responsibility to remember that. Remember that we're interwoven with all of these systems that we're a part of. I think in cities, we see that separateness between us and nature, and that can lead to a problem with people engaging with sustainability and climate change. But the more that we can remember that we're interrelated and we're not above these other forms of life, and that we have a responsibility to respect them. So that's one aspect of how language is power, our word choice matters. A second aspect that I've been learning through doing my research is language in the other dimension that I was speaking about. So English versus Indigenous languages. I do a lot of mapping in my research. Part of my work involves using maps to identify places that are vulnerable to climate change and that are important to communities, places that people want to protect as they see them being affected by climate change. Maps are very colonial, right? They were directly used in the settlement and colonization of these lands for navigation. And they were also used to erase Indigenous knowledge systems and languages. If you look at early maps of the Salish Sea, there were Indigenous place names on them. And gradually over time, those place names were replaced with colonial names, and very frequently with names of explorers or military folks from Europe, some people who never even set foot in this part of the world. Garibaldi, Howe Sound. Neither of those guys ever visited Canada, let alone the Pacific Northwest. So why do we name these amazing waterways and volcanoes after these people? So as I'm kind of interacting with mapping and I'm working with Indigenous communities, I'm trying to find a way to transform the system of documenting knowledge away from that exclusionary process and toward being a little bit more inclusionary and equitable. And that means bringing forward Indigenous place names, Squamish place names, Squamish place names. And in doing that, not only is the language coming in, but also all of the knowledge that's connected with those words. Because in a lot of Indigenous cultures, the place names do carry stories for those areas, and they're deeply associated with the place, with how it's changed. And all of that knowledge is critical in our conversations about climate change adaptation. And if we continue to exclude it from the conversations, then we're really just perpetuating the inequitable and extractive systems that have gotten us into this place in the first place. So those are the two principles that I thought would be potentially resonant with you today, given that we're at a university, we're in a research context, and that do speak to that kind of bigger picture, sometimes hard to tap into, radical systemic transformation piece that I think we all have a responsibility to play our part in. So I'm happy to speak to more specific adaptation actions at the community level I've seen folks do, perhaps in the discussion, but I hope that was of value to you. And yeah, thank you again for facilitating this conversation. It's really nice to hear from everybody.
Okay, so yeah, thanks to all our speakers. we've got some time before 5 o'clock for questions, but as has been the case for the previous sessions, we'll keep the discussion going for as long as people are fired up and want to engage. We will hand it over to our panel here in a sec. And then just before we do, I'm just going to give a quick word on what to expect next week as we do. Just do a couple things. Zoom again. All right. So just to give a heads up, some of the folks at the UBC Climate Emergency asked us to share this as well. So next week, actually, February 14th to 18th is Climate Emergency Week at UBC. And so there's a whole series of events happening associated with this, invited speakers, community dialogues. So just a couple highlights here. I forgot to put what the grand opening is for, but on Monday there's a grand opening for a new interactive sustainability center in the Student Life Building. There's a podcast being highlighted on Tuesday, open dialogues with the UBC leadership. And then Thursday, the final part of this series is actually included in the Climate Emergency Week series, and that's essentially going to be about our role within the UBC community and what the broad UBC climate action plans are and how we sort of fit in as a department and as members of UBC. So I just wanted to highlight that, and then on that note, here's the quick overview of next week's talks. So we have a series of speakers, including our very own Tara Ivanachko, and a few other folks around who will be talking to some of these different aspects of what's happening at UBC. And then, yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to Yoshi here, and please, anybody who has questions or comments. We'll have the panel, if you guys are all okay, come up and have a seat. Yeah. Mute your audio there.
All right, folks. Oh, there we go. Okay, folks. Oh, hold on. Okay, is that better? Yeah. All right, David, go ahead.
Stimulating discussion, and nice to hear things focus not just on content and information, but on approaches. So I think all of you are talking about collaborative work and teamwork and so forth. Do any of your departments allow or encourage co-authored theses and dissertations?
I mean, I have co-authors on every one of my dissertation chapters, and I haven't experienced resistance in that.
So the people actually submit one PhD dissertation with multiple authors?
I plan to.
Is your whole dissertation, or it's your dissertation with a series of papers that you've co-authored? Or is the whole dissertation multiple authors?
Oh, each chapter is co-authored. Yeah.
But the dissertation is yours.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of the things that we've been discussing as part of this collaborative PhD group, different models for this. And of course, there are certainly disciplinary norms. Certainly, and I feel my sense is in a lot of environmental science spaces, the model that you just described, Fiona, is at least accepted, right? That you have chapters that are co-authored and it's still part of your dissertation. I feel like where you start to see differences even just between committees and departments is, okay, well, for some of those other co-authors, which of those co-authors get to put which parts also in their dissertations? Or is it possible to have a chapter that you all have in each of your dissertations, because it's something that it's not just the lead author, but everyone, each contributor's part was really central to it, right? So it's not just like main author and then everyone else. And I think that's where, I'm saying this as like a faculty member, sometimes I feel like we feel really tied up in convention, but it's, I feel like we actually potentially have some power to change this. But it is tricky because it's like, oh, well, how do our graduates, how will their work be perceived by external examiners and other things like that, which I think is tricky. But the fact that I'm hearing this question, and I've started to hear it, and a lot more colleagues, I feel like we're discussing it, I feel like is opening up some space for that kind of discussion, because I think that is where it gets tricky, right? Because it's like, oh, like, well, I still need owners, or like I need to be first author on these sorts of things, and that can sometimes make it challenging for stuff that really actually is like, this would not exist and could not exist without, you know, core contributions and ways of thinking and from multiple people. So, I mean, I would be curious also to hear from others, like, what would your dream, like dream collaborative PhD look like? And would it include that kind of authorship practice?
Thank you.
Just have a, oh boy.
I guess I have one response to that too. UBC has this Public Scholars Initiative, which is a program that supports PhD students to do work oriented more towards contributing to the public. And I know several people who received funding from them specifically to create non-traditional ways of communicating their dissertation research, whether that's funding to do a mini documentary or to work on a specific public outreach project. And I think that's fantastic. And what would be cooler is if that flexibility in communicating your dissertation actually became a viable option rather than creating a written dissertation, which is maybe becoming a little bit of an archaic production of knowledge, because I don't really know how many people read dissertations front to back, right? Maybe some people do, but I feel like in my department, at least, people rant about how like there's going to be like 2 people that read it after all of that work. So maybe it would be more effective to produce short videos or, I don't know, comic books that like share that information in a much more accessible way, and to have it not be something that like a few select students apply for funding to do, and it's more like built into the structure of the university.
The one thing I can add on this topic for somebody that's not been in academia for a long time, but we often try to partner with academia on research projects, and sometimes we do, but typically one of the main challenges is just the timing of knowledge production within academia is so slow compared to what is needed to be relevant in the public policy discussion, that, and so there's something there, and I agree with you, like sort of solution there is kind of moving away from, you know, only peer-reviewed publication count and having like, okay, here's the other collateral that you created that also count as knowledge production, because it's sort of like, you know, gray literature collateral. That's all we produce at the minute, and it, you know, I think it is a bit more impactful than most, because the number of times that I've seen like either like a politician or a bureaucrat refer to a peer-reviewed paper, like it's very rare. Like they need something that's a lot more easy, friendly, mostly because they're not the only people that need to read it, right? Like they need to be able to pass it on to somebody that's got even less time than them, and they can go, okay, yes, I get it. And so like, I think it would be really powerful to have the capacity to create things that are for external purposes as part of like doctoral and master's projects.
You know, we have other questions, but I would just add, I would love if granting agencies also included that as eligible funding expenses. You know, we were talking also just about like making, we're funded by a lot of us are funded by public dollars, and a lot of that knowledge is actually not accessible either to the communities that we work with or to the broader public. And it's always like, we always have good intentions, like, okay, I'm going to make this interactive, like we're going to put this website up, we're going to do this thing. And then when push comes to shove, it's like, oh, I gotta, like that ends up not necessarily being where the priorities are or that we have funding to do. And I would love, yeah, that to have other ways of other forms of like communicating and producing knowledge to be funded as well. Because I think, yeah, that would lead to a lot more.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, there's a push, I think, to write more lay summaries in the year.
I don't know. I can't even see it.
There's a push to write lay summaries with a lot of peer-reviewed work now. I even did an application for a next job where I had to do a lay summary of my thesis. I did one for my thesis recently as well, just for this university. I find it a good practice for myself to communicate just with the public. Do you find in government, do politicians actually read lay summaries? Are they even aware that they exist? I mean, I know there's executive summaries for like IPCC report and stuff, so.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, like, obviously, like it's a broad spectrum. Like there are politicians that are super wonks and read tons and tons of things, but the average, and again, like back to the chart, like politicians not our only audience, right? Like bureaucrats, senior bureaucrats, and so the further down you go, the more specialized they are, the more time they might have to go find something. But even for like bureaucrats that are quite specialized, like during reading peer-reviewed research, I think it's pretty rare. So like the work of translation, and it's not just, at the end of the day, it's not just what the knowledge is, it's who conveys the knowledge matters a lot. Like even when we do communication as Femina, whenever we can like get industry or health sector or like partner with other sector or just get them to be the messenger, it's a lot more powerful. So it's also who they align with and who they trust as a source. And a peer-reviewed document doesn't, it gives a certain seal of quality, of course, but it doesn't necessarily give them, okay, that person, I see what vein they're from, and if I can kind of trust where they're coming at it from.
So maybe a better solution is to have train more science translators and communicate and actually present to politicians and bureaucrats in person and build those relationships.
Yeah, or just more partnership, right? Like it doesn't need, not everybody needs to turn into a lobbyist, but people, civic society or like community groups that need to have a certain influence, hey, like, yeah, you produce that knowledge. Can you produce like a briefing note with it, or like an infographic, or like, this is what I need to talk to my band council, or this is what I need to talk to my MP, or that sort of partnership would be helpful. And for that not to just be kind of, extra work for graduate students, like actually, count towards, because it's not as if, grad students have infinite amount of time and capacity either.
Yeah, we have this with the committee here, the planning committee with all these ideas. We want to do more of these events, but then push comes to shove, we don't have the capacity. We have to publish papers. So we're hitting that roadblock all the time, even though we have ambitions to do more.
And also, I think it would be really valuable to get more education on how to make effective infographics, or how to represent your research in a way that I think that it's one thing to translate a thesis into more words, but taking a thesis and translating it into another form of another medium that is digestible by a wider range of people can be really, really hard. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or strategies on how you approach that, but to any of you, but I've just been trying to do that myself, and it's really challenging. And I don't even know how to start to look online for the sorts of resources, how to take words and turn it into something that means more.
I mean, there's so many, it's a huge topic. I mean, that's like what the challenge of science communication in general is, right? Like how much content do we feed people versus what's actually our desired impact? What do we want to make people feel in order to get them to change? And do they actually need my content in order to do that? Or should I be speaking to them about why I'm doing science and my motivations for doing my work? Because that would probably connect with them and sit with them more strongly. And then I can feed in a little bit of my information as it relates to that conversation. But like, I think that's where I found the greatest strength in connecting with communities and building the trust because also people aren't gonna, as I think we're learning in society, like people aren't gonna agree with your science unless they trust you. And so getting people to trust you first relies on them seeing who you are and really like getting to know you as a person. So that's probably a good tip too for scientists and researchers to like think about a little bit, is like how we bring forward our heart and our identity, and then how that can be enmeshed in our story of our research. And then, yeah. But there's, yeah, I think everybody's gonna need to figure out a different approach, or as you said, like not everybody has to become a science communicator. We can work and partner with science communicators, and that can be extremely effective.
I think that Fiona's point around like the importance of the effective and the communication is super important. And I think like as we move, broader into the scope of what we're trying to affect, like your capacity to collect personally decreases. It still matters. And again, like back to like, what's the value of lobbyists? Big part of lobbyists is just spending a lot of time with decision makers so that they feel comfortable and they trust them, which means that when they say something, they're more willing to hear. But obviously, like we often don't have those resources. So the proxy for this is like reputation. It is, okay, this comes from this organization, or like Feminist Institute has a certain path within government because they know that we research our things and that we're aware of how they work, and therefore that we can give them information that is usable for them, these sort of things. So like that same trust, I think as you move up in the complexity, needs to become from an individual thing, which you can have in a community, to a collective things. And that's where like, yeah, you need knowledge brokers. You need people that trust. And I think the like universities as institution like punch a bit below their weight on this. Like this coming from a university should matter more. And it doesn't quite, or it has a hard time lending. It does sometimes when when we see like letters, open letters from X many scientists or researchers said that X needs to be done. I think like these actually start like have a certain moral heft. But when it comes to specific information, like yeah, there's something there around the capacity to take the seal of trust that the university should create. Maybe it's too broad. I'm not sure it's you might know more about that.
I was actually inspired by both of your comments. I was thinking both about like one of the things I've been excited to participate in more recently is more participatory knowledge co-creation in the form of civic science projects. So I have this odor smellscape project that's collaborative with my colleagues Naomi Zimmerman and Sarah Henderson in public health and mechanical engineering, and lots of great students, postdocs, and it was not a huge planned part of the project. Like it was part of the project, but it ended up just being so much bigger because I feel like people connected with it in a way that was deeply personal. So people share, like you share your own experiences of odor. You can go and read other people's experiences of odor. Other people started doing different things with that. And I think there was something about that ways of co-creating, being part of the process, and then also being able to interact with like the data knowledge, other things in ways that people felt deeply connected to in a personal way, that ended up being a lot more powerful, both at the personal, but then I think at the like connecting to like broader community issues way. So I wonder that's also like, it's not just, I think, Fiona, you were talking about this earlier too, like it's also about co-creation and not just like the translating part, but I think finding opportunities also for creating knowledge together, interpreting knowledge together, I think is maybe one way of like connecting that personal and larger scale sometimes.
Question, Amanda, I've heard you use the word scaffolding before in terms of, right, I don't speak very loudly. I've heard you use the word scaffolding before in terms of building structure for training and providing opportunity. I'm curious, as folks who are doing research or doing PhDs, and a lot of us are going on to do things that are not science, pretty high percentage actually. What sort of scaffolding would you put in? Would you imagine putting in place that would provide kind of the framework and the information that a new PhD coming in could view and understand? Here's my possible pathways. Here's my actual outcomes in terms of likelihood of going on to academia or not. And therefore, like, I guess I'm trying to think about what are the systemic changes we could make to build opportunity for those interdisciplinary learnings, and whether that's something that's a little different than producing traditional pieces, for example.
Yeah, so your question makes me, I think the reality is that sometimes sometimes our undergraduate programs are designed with a lot more intentionality sometimes than our graduate programs. So when we talk about scaffolding, part of that is that idea that, you know, you want to give, it's kind of what it sounds like. You want to like scaffold people's progress towards certain kinds of learning goals and outcomes. And I think at the undergraduate program level, we're often very intentional about that, right? Like, especially at a curricular level, right? Like you get introduced to this concept maybe in year one, but then it deepens a little bit in year two, maybe in year three, you do more problem-based open inquiry, so that, you know, in year four, you're doing this community engaged learning. I'm thinking of like EMBR 400 or something in this department. You're you know, it's really open. It's real world stakes and impacts because you're working with actual, you know, real world partners. But that's not the first thing you do, right? Like you need to learn in safe, you want to push your comfort zones and be learning, but not way beyond your depth right at the outset. You don't want to be set up to fail because that's not like super well designed for learning. So I think we try to be quite intentional about that, I think, at the undergraduate level, but, you know, there's so much, I think at the graduate level sometimes because it's different research and different paths are so different, it's harder maybe sometimes to build some of that in, but I think we absolutely could, right, if we were more thoughtful about it. And I think that one of the ideas of scaffolding, yeah, is that like you don't just go straight to the deep end, right? Like maybe we start in the little like kiddie pool. And so what are some kiddie pool versions of some of the things that we just talked about, especially when the stakes are real, right? And especially when we're talking about resources, time, even just attention, right? The attention of like our partners, the public, like that's something that's really precious. So like, yeah, I think it's a great question, right? So like, you know, maybe should we incorporate like infographic design as a deliverable in more of our classes, like rather than you write your final paper, it's like you design like this piece and we do it in a course context. And that helps you build that competency so that when you go to your research, you feel a little bit more comfortable doing that. I think I'm really glad you asked that idea because I'm gonna, you know, go to my department and see like, oh, we should talk about like how we're doing this at the graduate level. But I think there are ways we can do it curricularly, and then also I think, you know, Fiona mentioned things like public scholars. Like I think there are these other opportunities that exist at the university too, but maybe we can find better ways of like tying it in and making it more common. And as you said, like saying like, here's some pathway examples. So like, hey, like if you think you might be really interested in this sort of career, maybe in your first summer, you do a sustainability scholars internship or you do something like that. And maybe just even helping people find their paths a little, maybe that's a good investment of our.
I think so. Speaking for myself, a lot of these pathways that I now know exist, I had no clue for the first 2 years of PhD. For example, sustainability scholars I only knew about when it was arguably too late in my program for me to realistically pull it off. So I think that somehow building the framework that understanding what's out there and what the pathways are is a great start for anybody.
And I would just kind of reiterate, like you're right, like there is a risk of both like stakeholder fatigue and like whenever you're working with real problems, there's only so many, you know, stakeholders that you can talk to. And that's why I think like internal things like TAing, like teaching, like especially as the teaching moves away from being kind of like one directional and more problem-based learning, like tons of skills to be built internally there that are usually transferable.
Slightly challenging question that we fell through here actually. So last week we had a pretty interesting but difficult discussion about how you reconcile really two things. The first one was that the transition to a renewable energy grid is anticipated to cost huge amounts of resources, minerals particularly. Something like a 9-fold increase in all of the mining we've ever done. That's accounting for things like people consume less and having better efficiency and things like that. The other half of it, which how to do that without destroying our environment and without protecting the rights, indigenous peoples, and things like that. So it's some of your comments in particular have me thinking about this because this is a very hard topic. But what are I guess my question for you is how would you change the framework of that problem in terms of we're thinking about we need extra resources, how do we do that even in the best sustainable way possible without local communities or without infringing on people's rights? How would you change the framework of thinking? So it's a hard question.
Oh, it's such a hard question, but it's a good one to like think into. Because even like energy transitions aside, like we depend on mining for resources. So and mining is an intrinsically extractive industry. So how do you reconcile just kind of even like wanting to work with mining because it's so degrading in so many ways, but we have to, and like mining is a system that should really transform, has a big responsibility to transform its behavior, not only because its impact right now, but because for so many centuries, it's done so much damage and there's like huge legacies of degradation of communities and waterways and everything because of historic mining that now the mining community now is inheriting. So I think it goes back to those guiding principles of like, okay, we're dealing with an extractive industry. There's no way to get around that really. So how do we bring forward equity as much as we can? And how do we bring forward collaboration and respect and reciprocity as much as we can? Like these industries have a huge responsibility to up their game on bringing forward those notions and I guess public society, like as you were pointing out, public society should be pressuring them as much as possible so that they change. I saw this, okay, yeah. I mean, mining also has a lot of like internal issues just in terms of how it operates as an industry. I think a couple of weeks ago, Rio Tinto, like one of the bigger mining companies, had this like horrific DEI report that came out on how it operates internally, and like that didn't really rattle its stock performance and stuff. So sometimes stuff like that happens, and you just sort of shake your head, and you're like, how is this happening? I think public groups need to pressure the mining sector strongly, and they need to change their behavior, but also like they need to do their work. And as much as we can highlight examples of mining being done well, that's important to do, and encourage them to be doing work in partnership with local communities. But it's super challenging. Like, I don't know. Yeah. I think it's that whole one size fits all solution. It's not a thing. It's about principles and just reminding yourself of those core principles.
Good answer. So Tompierre, in the BC climate plan, do they have anything in there for mining pieces?
It's a good question. I worked less on the industrial side. So big thing that happened on the BC climate plan in the last year and a bit is that they moved to having sectoral targets. So there's a carbon reduction target by 2030 and 2050, but more importantly for 2030, for the building and community sector, for transportation, for oil and gas specifically, and then the rest of the industry. And it was actually very helpful that they separated oil and gas from the rest of the industry. Talking about like policy design, there's 10 different ways you can cut that pie, and how you cut it has implication on what sort of policies you can implement after. So it was a good call to separate this. As oil and gas alone is about 20% of emissions in BC, and the rest of industry is about 19%, I think. So so right now the gas the cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector in BC has not been like regulated yet. We don't know yet how it's going to be implemented. The federal government is working with the same problem. They're also working on having an overall cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. So the two are probably going to coordinate, and it will probably, my guess is, end up being more or less like a emission permit trading scheme, like the carbon trading in Europe. For the rest of the industrial system, I don't know if like how that's going to be set up. I don't know yet. A big part of how province is kind of driving efficiency there is like by helping companies fund carbon reduction projects. So there's a whole fund, part of our carbon task, go into this Clean BC industrial kind of fund to help pay for lower mitigation. All the conversation that we're having globally around the role of public subsidies in the oil and gas system, because one of those, should we continue to incentivize, provide subsidies for oil and gas if it's to help them decarbonize, whether it's like by better processes or capture and sequestration of their CO2 on site. So there's a lot of kind of policy complexity that's not being figured out, nor federally, nor in these issues. These are all live conversations.
Yeah, we've been having a lot of those conversations about the technical aspects of a lot of those things internally in recent weeks. Curious if any of that's true with them. So then my question for Amanda is, if I'm someone who wants to design a systems-based solution from maybe on a mining company, I want to work with several different indigenous groups in a large area, and I want to design a systems-based solution to tackle some of these issues. I don't want you to design a solution. Just like what are the things that you would tell that company to learn? What are the things you tell them to learn to be able to build that solution?
That's still a really big question. I think maybe echo a lot of the things Fiona has already said, right, about process and reciprocity, and also add, I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think it's also really important to not treat things ahistorically. It's really important to kind of acknowledge what our starting points are and what has happened before, because I think sometimes one of the pitfalls of, we talk about process a lot. Process absolutely matters and participation matters, but if the starting point, not everyone has the same resources to participate equally. There are long legacies of past actions that kind of brought us where we are, and so even when we have the best processes possible, if they don't also take into account historical context, that alone also, process alone is also not a solution. So I think those are, so like, like in the context, let's say like if it was like here in BC, like really thinking about jurisdiction and sovereignty, right? And like, and what does that mean? Like where that's happening? What do different legal orders like that are overlapping might mean, things like that, that I think are really important in addition to kind of having that good process. And I think we emphasize process so much, right? Because it needs to be context dependent. Like there aren't just like thresholds that you can apply everywhere. And because things really need to be place-based, we do focus on process, but we need to think about history in that process.
I had just a couple bits on that. So like the Chilcolton decision, Supreme Court, like was very unique to that region. Like the burden of proof for the Chilcolton to show that they've been, continuously occupying this land since first contact is a very high burden of proof that they were able to do it in part because they were like contacted quite late in the history of colonization. But nevertheless, like they won the right to not just to veto project, but to veto existing project after the fact. Like if they did not provide, if they did not get, prior and informed consent for projects that are in their territory, they can actually ask these projects to be removed. Like I don't know how well that has like permeated the whole resource development mentality in BC, but like if there are more cases like this, like if you did not do your due diligence around prior and informed consent, your whole project could, in year 5, just get pulled out. That's a big systemic change. And like, so, part of the things that we could do is like, well, help similar decisions happen in the rest of the territories. That would go a long way. And there's some legal funds that are helped to make that happen. So donating to those funds is a pretty big option. But the other side of that coin is also like equity, like First Nations being equity owner of these projects changes a little bit the paradigm and changes the nature of the conversation. Doesn't necessarily change the extractive nature of the project. Like there's a whole, suite of complexities there. And we see that happen a lot with the renewable energy industry within BC, which is, like when BC decided to go ahead with Site C, all other renewable projects kind of went like, well, okay, there's not going to be any demand for our electricity. And there's one buyer, BC Hydro, anytime soon. And so there's lots of projects, and all these small independent power producer are typically done in partnership with First Nation at some various level. So there's lots of opportunity for economic development and potentially energy self-sufficiency in First Nations if these partnerships are set up right. But the problem right now is like there's a whole spectrum of how these partnerships are set up, from like just a benefit agreement. Well, we're going to have this project and we'll give you X, Y, Z so that you have some benefit, to actually at full equity, and then to like equity with some control. So there's a spectrum there, and I think like the resource sector, I mean, it's more, obviously it's difficult if we think back about the role of like earth scientists in that ecosystem. Like you're rarely the one negotiating the deals, but I wouldn't discount either like the importance of like internal staff pressure and like asking those questions, like, hey, how is the deal set up? And just knowing that language, it's like, why didn't we go for a deal with equity and control rather than just contribution agreement? And having this conversation happening internally can actually have a significant impact.
Thank you for those answers. It's 5:30 and I'm conscious of making you all sit in those retreat lab stools for much longer. So we'll call it there if there are no other questions. Thanks very much to all three of you.
The courageous crowd who came in person.
Yeah.
To folks online who managed to bear the